Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I know people are still streaming in, but I just wanted to get the program started so we have enough time. Thank you for joining us. My name is Silvia Rohr Samaniego. I am the director of the University Art Gallery, or the UAG, at the University of Pittsburgh. Before we begin the program, I would like to take just a short minute to do an access check for our panelists and our guests. To describe what you're seeing on the screen, I am a white Latina with dark brown, medium length hair. I'm wearing dark rimmed glasses and a black top with gold earrings. Behind me are shelves filled with books. This event will be closed captioned and recorded, so you will be able to access this later. And I also wanted to ensure you that there's a chat and Q&A feature in the lower right if you have additional needs or questions. I want to take a moment to thank the UAG and Museum Studies team at Pitt, particularly Janina Lopez and Hannah Powell, and our access providers for making all of this possible. I am pleased to welcome you to the 7th installment of Turning Points, a conversation series focusing on pertinent issues in museum practice. We began this series in 2021, and our focus for today is on a topic that is very important: pay equity in museums. Our panelists for today include Millar Fisher, who I will introduce more fully in a moment, Dr. Nicole Cook, Program Manager for Graduate Academic Partnerships at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Trustee of the Philadelphia Museum of Art Union, and founding member of Art and Transparency. And our third panelist is Hettie Judah, writer, campaigner, and co-founder of the Art Working Parents Alliance. Thank you all so much for joining us for this important discussion, and thank you to all the attendees for being here. We hope you will take part in chat and Q&A. Before I hand this over to our facilitator, it is my honor to offer a few words of introductions for her. Millar Fisher is currently the Ronald C. and Anita L. Wornick Curator of Contemporary Decorative Arts within the Contemporary Art Department at the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston. Her work focuses on the intersections of people, power, and the material world. She has helped start the Art and Museum Transparency Spreadsheet in 2019 and has been part of the unions at MoMA, the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and the Museum of Fine Arts, Boston, where she is currently a union delegate. I have been so honored to collaborate with Michelle on the design of today's program. Thank you, Michelle, for all the work you do in our community, but also all the work you have done to convene us here today. With that, I hand it over to you to open up the discussion and the introductions for our panelists. Thank you. I think you might be muted, Michelle.
Thank you. That is a wonderful way to start. I was very excited to start. So I hope you can hear me now. Thank you so much, Sylvia, for that wonderful introduction, and also to Hannah and Janina for everything that you've done to make it possible for us to gather here today. It's my delight to introduce the two wonderful panelists, and I'm going to do so with a few slides. And so I'm going to pull them up just now, and you should be able to see them loading shortly. I'm so honored to be able to be in conversation today with Dr. Nicole Cook. You see her full, well, not even her full resume and bio here, but I met Nicole when I was working at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, where, as Sylvia said, she has been program manager for graduate academic partnerships for many years, looking after not only Mellon funded and other grant partnerships, but also many humans as well. She and I and other colleagues collaborated on Art and Museum Transparency back in 2019. And she has been an incredibly important part of the unionizing efforts and organization at the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'm also so delighted to be in conversation with somebody else I admire greatly, the UK-based author Hettie Judah. Hettie is the chief art critic, as it says here, for the British daily paper The Eye, and a regular contributor to The Guardian, The Apollo, and many other wonderful publications and outlets. I was very excited to see her thinking about the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. And she recently published How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents, which is one among many other books that she has authored on many different topics. She's currently working on a book and a Hayward touring exhibition on art and motherhood, which opens at the Arnolfini in Bristol next March. And she's going to talk a little bit about that research and also co-founding the Art Working Parents Alliance in the United Kingdom. But before I invite Hettie and Nicole to come to the Zoom platform, I wanted to lay the table a little over the next few minutes. So pay equity means different things to different people. And this is a slide I often share when I talk about pay equity. It's bound by things like intersectional identity, social location, and the nature of the field in which one works. And yet at its root for most of us, however, it means really a fair wage and a fair workplace. What does that mean for us in the world of art museums and in the larger art world today? That's part of what we will discuss this afternoon. It's a particularly rich and fruitful time to be asking these questions. Over the last 4 years, our arts workplaces have experienced significant change, as well as unsurprising entrenchment of broken systems. In terms of both of those aspects, it was in early 2019 that the New Museum Union filed for recognition, so almost 4 years ago really now, sparking a veritable domino effect in other museums across the country. And then 5 months later, Art and Museum Transparency created a spreadsheet that caused a viral conversation around salary transparency and pay equity. And then, of course, came the pandemic. So 4 years on, other significant unions have been formed, including, as Nicole will talk about, at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, the MFA in Boston, where I am, MassMoCA, the Whitney, the Guggenheim, and the De Young Museum, amongst many others. And unions are an important part of the conversation on pay equity, certainly, but they are not the whole part. Pay equity relies on a host of complex factors, including nonprofit structures, so thinking about museum leadership, governance, HR departments, and them being willing to view pay equity for staff as part of the pathway toward achieving their mission for greater diversity and parity overall within their institutions, as well as pay bands and figures being posted with job descriptions. And I want to shout out to the amazing work that the National Museum Emerging Museum Professionals Network is doing on this. They actually have a sign-up sheet, and we will share the link for it amongst other resources where you can send in a job posting if it doesn't have the salary on it or the pay band, and they will argue on our behalf to make sure that that is shared. It also requires solidarity across internal departments and externally across nonprofit sectors, including independent workers. And part of that really is being able to have these numbers out in public. For example, New York's salary transparency law finally going into effect fairly recently. So this afternoon, we're going to hear from speakers who are going to share their own personal and professional experiences around important aspects of pay equity, before we then have a discussion about the questions and issues and ideas that they, and also we hope you as an audience, bring to this topic. We know that some of you are watching in groups, some of you on your own. Many in the room have not only questions to ask, but really important expertise to bring to the table. And so as the moderator of the conversation, I will be looking closely at the chat, and I really welcome your questions and comments and conversation at any point during the discussion, and we'll make sure that we fold those in. We've asked the speakers to offer concrete tools, approaches, or case study examples to illustrate the areas that they're going to focus on. And so Nicole is going to talk a little bit about the union at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, as well as about art.
I think Michelle has frozen on this bit. Nicole, I wonder if you would like to begin your presentation.
Sure. Hi everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. All right. Thank you, Sylvia, and thank you, Sylvia, for having me in as part of this series. I've been really looking forward to this talk today and being here. So I don't actually have slides. I have done a lot of talking about. Hi, Michelle. We were just I think Sylvia and I were just trying to move things along, but if you'd like to jump back in, that's great.
Tell me, I'm so sorry that I froze there. I apologize. The MFA has had us online for a couple of years at this point, but sometimes our Wi-Fi is just a little tricky. What feels most comfortable, Sylvia? Nicole, I don't want to interrupt you. I'm happy to sum up, or if you're right in the middle of flow, go for it.
I think it's helpful to sum up, and maybe especially that framing question that we're all kind of keeping in mind, if that's all right.
Absolutely. That sounds wonderful. So I won't pull the PowerPoint back up. I'll just make sure that I start the framing question. So some of the goals that we hope that Nicole, Hettie, and myself, and the conversation that we'll have with the folks gathered in the audience tonight are to think about issues of mass unionization, thinking about the silent but palpable hierarchies of the museum and the ways in which pay transparency and wall-to-wall organizing in unions, but as part of larger frameworks of solidarity, can help name and dismantle the issues of power that we face around pay equity, and to think about that intersectionally as well. The conversation is framed around the idea of a turning point, a tipping point, or a moment of catalyzation for each speaker. And these questions are certainly specifically and particularly on my mind as a union delegate at the MFA in Boston, where I've worked for the last 4 years. I actively participated in the unionization of the museum, and I did so because I come from a working class single parent family, and financial independence through work was and is critical to being an autonomous working person. Being part of a union allowed me and my colleagues greater safety and support in the workplace, and I see that union paying off quite literally in terms of being able to allow our members to claim for significant temporary pay relief when there are absences or vacancies in certain departments. However, its limits are certainly being tested. I filed a grievance of my own recently, and that is in arbitration, and I'm happy to talk about that more when we get to discussion. So I'll leave by saying these discussions around labor equity have always been important. There was a heightened tenor to them during the pandemic when the norms of the workplace were swiftly and very severely upended. But it's perhaps even more important at this moment in time to continue to keep the flames of this conversation alive, as burnout from the past couple of years becomes ever more real, and museum institutions remain often ill-equipped to meet this challenge. And so in terms of the framing question that we have for this evening, I've asked each of the speakers, Nicole first and then Hettie, to both introduce themselves and offer a brief overview of their stake in the conversation tonight around labor and the art world. What has catalyzed their involvement personally and professionally? What goals or hopes do they hold for pay equity in the near future and the far future in the field? And what were their turning points in their careers related to tonight's topic? So Nicole, if you could kick us off, if you would be willing to share how you've been invested in conversations around labor in the art world from the point of view of AMT and the union at the PMA, that would be wonderful. And then Hettie, I look forward to welcoming you after Nicole. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michelle. And thank you, as I was saying, thank you, Sylvia, for, I'm just really excited to be here as part of this panel for description. I am a white woman. I use she, her pronouns with short blonde hair. I'm sitting in a room also with a bunch of books behind me. And I'm also wanting to point out that I am wearing my Museums Are Not Neutral t-shirt, co-founded by a graduate school buddy and someone I really look up to, LaTanya Autry. So I also want to just point out the solidarity in the chat within Pennsylvania, both in the Philadelphia area with people from Penn Museum here. And also I want to give a huge shout out to our friends at Carnegie who've done such amazing organizing work over the past few years as well. So I was saying I don't actually have slides prepared. I've done a lot of talking recently in representing my union, Local 397, and specifically the Philadelphia Museum of Art Union. But I took the opportunity in today's panel and considering the kind of guiding questions that we're thinking about to really look more at my personal trajectory and how basically how I went from art historian to activist and labor activist specifically. So I am 37. I've been in my current position at the Philadelphia Museum of Art for about 5 years now, in a grant-funded position, so ultimately a temporary position. And I also have a degree, advanced degrees in art history. I started out as a studio artist and a studio arts major. So I'm also really excited to talk about artist worker rights and artist rights as well. And having Hettie here, I think is a great way to lead into that. So in thinking about my turning point, my stake in this conversation has gotten me thinking about kind of how I got to be where I am right now as not just a member of a union, but a labor organizer in the fields of the arts and also academia. So I grew up in a military family. My father was in the U.S. Air Force, and I think in a strange kind of way, the support that military families receive and the system of an intense level of social support and social fabric that exists within the culture of military workers and their families is one that I definitely took for granted as a kid. So even if we didn't have a ton of money, we had this social support of free healthcare and tax-free shopping and free social programs and all sorts of things that we never would have had if my father was not serving in that role. So as I became interested in the arts, and first as someone who wanted to survive as an artist myself, and then after going into kind of the route of art history and curating and museum work, I really was late in learning how that intersection of a lack of social support, a lack of social resources, really works against anyone who's interested in a creative field, which particularly in the U.S., but obviously in other places as well, but particularly in this country, I think that there's almost that there can be a very negative perception of even supporting the arts and humanities at all, and it becomes very politicized. And I think that has led directly to the lack of social resources for working artists who are not coming from generations of wealth and privilege. So when I decided to go to graduate school, this was not something that other people in my family had done, and certainly not a PhD program. And as I was navigating through those circles, I know Michelle and I have connected because we both went to public universities, public schools for our graduate work, and are very invested in the importance of public education. And as I was moving through those kind of higher ed circles, I realized that that by and large, there was this divide between graduate students who had come from the family of academics and that had a fair amount of generational knowledge as well as kind of support that I didn't have access to. I felt like people were speaking another language on some level when they talked about how they spent their summers and how they'd gotten into art history. It was a very different trajectory than the one I had. And so I've always tried to be conscious of that when I started teaching, when I became more invested in being an educator and developing a philosophy around that. And in my current work at the PMA with interns and fellows, it's been hugely important. And I would say that the real turning point for me was getting onto the job market post grad school, during grad school, and just realizing how tough it is out there. And so by the time I started working at the PMA and met Michelle, there were already a lot of conversations happening around Kimberly Drew, who had shared her salary history in a really powerful presentation. And also the adjunct transparency spreadsheet initiatives were out there. And so when we started having conversations around art and museum transparency with a small group of other very close friends and colleagues, it really felt that the time was right. And as Michelle can also speak to, we also had no idea that it would really take on the national and the international life that it did in those early months of 2019. The other interesting thing is that I was having these conversations at the time I was anonymous, and with some of our other friends and colleagues closely involved, we were having these conversations about the ripple effects of getting a bunch of museum and art salary information out there to people, the people we were hearing from, the people who were actively using it in negotiations or in talking to human resources and actively applying it. And the effect of that was so immediate and so broad and so immediately relevant to our daily lives in a way that, frankly, I love my academic scholarship, but in a way that none of my academic scholarship had connected with people. And I think that showed me the power of collective and the power of cutting to the point, getting to the point of talking about the real issues that impact people. And so, yeah, and Michelle's putting up the link. So we've all kind of moved on into different forms of our activism. And for me, that very quickly manifested in organizing at the PMA. So I'm not someone who in any way thought of myself as a labor activist or an organizer. We started out having conversations with coworkers around the museum right along that same summer during 2019. And when we realized that there were multiple conversations that we were having, it became really powerful, and that led to our union organizing, continuing further and launching our union election campaign in early 2020. So to give a very bird's eye view of the process from organizing to strike, we won our election in the summer of 2020 in August with an 89% win. That, I should say, also happened as many of our furloughed colleagues' positions were eliminated and our staff was reduced by about 100 people. And then we negotiated from fall of 2020 to fall, specifically October of 2022. We spent those 2 years at the bargaining table with management representatives and with our AFSCME affiliate siblings. And it took 2 years to get to the point where we needed action. We needed it quickly, and that led to our decision to strike last October. That lasted 19 days. It's one of the hardest, best things that I've ever done in my career. And I'm excited to be here talking about these issues that are relevant to me and so many of my colleagues and friends in the field. So with that, I will pass things back to Michelle. Thank you.
I'll do that again. Nicole, thank you so much. I'm so grateful for you kicking us off, and I have many questions that I want to come back to for both you and Hettie, thinking about that lack of social support and resources, or the lack of a network, and the ways in which pay equity and pay transparency feeds into the idea of making the idea, certainly maybe not in concrete practice, making jobs in the art world more accessible and offering some parity. But for now, Hettie, I wonder if you would be able to switch your camera on so we can welcome you. And I know that you're going to touch on elements of your research, your recent book project, but also thinking about the Art Working Parents Alliance. So it's my delight to welcome you here. Thank you so much for being with us. And I will cede the floor so that you have it.
Thank you so much, Michelle. Hello, I'm Hettie Judah. I'm a 50-year-old white woman of Jewish origin. I've got short dark hair, wearing a black dress and a spotty white polo neck. And I'm sitting in a room not filled with books, actually filled with quite a lot of paintings and posters and things. And I'm in the UK, so it's quite dark behind me, I'm afraid. I'm going to talk a little tiny bit about my turning point, since this is the title of this talk series. But I'm really more interested in talking on behalf of the Art Working Parents Alliance, which is an initiative it's quite a baby initiative by comparison to the rather sophisticated and well-developed initiatives that Nicole and Michelle have been involved in. So I'm really, I think, more here to learn from them than to talk. But so I've got, like many of us in the art world, a rather hybrid career. I'm a writer, I'm an art critic, I've curated some exhibitions. I also do some lecturing, so I'm a bit of an educator. And I moved to London, having been working in continental Europe in 2010. I came here as a single parent with 2 children of primary age. And that was right really at the beginning of the financial crisis, so there wasn't much work knocking around. So it was obviously, you know, my participation in the art world at that point as a single parent was extremely limited. And I think one thing that on reflection I've come to realize is that as single parents in the art world, we're quite often very invisible to one another, because by definition, we're not the people who are networking. We're the people who are unable to network because we can't be out there between 6 and 8 in the evening going to private views or attending all of these, you know, functions and kind of trips to go and see things. And so there's not really any understanding for us that there are other people out there going through the same things quite often, because we're not seeing one another. And that became quite evident when I started to research the impact of parenthood on people's careers in the art world a few years later. So I've essentially been working freelance as well, and I think that's something that's really worth bringing up in this conversation, because we're talking about salaries quite a lot, and there are different issues that assail freelancers. Quite often we're expected to work for a project fee, and there's an expectation of a lot of extra work and overtime, so you end up with what seems like a generous project fee, but it ends up being a very small hourly rate. That goes for artists on commissions as well as writers on commissions. So I really started to look specifically at the question of motherhood after reporting for a few years on, first of all, a few excellent reports that have been done in the UK on social mobility in the arts. So there's a brilliant report called Panic: Social Class, Taste and Inequalities in the Creative Industries that came out a few years ago. And I will send a link to this, which looked at social mobility and diversity in the arts. And it painted a fairly poor picture, particularly of the visual arts, I should say. And there have also been a few excellent studies done into gender balance in the arts. So in the United States, you've had the wonderful Burns-Halperin report that I think the first one came out about 4 or 5 years ago. And they've done a subsequent report that came out, I think, in December last year. And in the UK, we've had a series of about 7 annual reports done by the Freelands Foundation, looking at the representation of women artists and women in the arts in Britain. And I started to be quite interested in some of the factors that were perhaps playing into the lack of, well, the lack of representation of female artists in the UK at certain levels. So there was obviously many women and non-binary students at A level, at the end of high school, at BA level, at MA level. But then once you started to get into representation by commercial galleries, there was this sudden splitting that seemed to happen. And I was very curious as to whether there were other factors at play that really were making things very difficult for women and non-binary artists when they came into their 30s. And one thing that I was curious about in particular was whether starting a family was having a huge impact. So I started to research, I guess, at the end of 2019, and I was commissioned by Freelands Foundation by Dr. Kate Macmillan to write an essay about the impact of motherhood on artists' careers. And I started the kind of full research on that really at the start of the pandemic, and perhaps as a result of the pandemic, because I had a lot more free time, I ended up interviewing about 50 artists. So they were all UK-based artists, but they were they had origins around the world. So I think we had a number of artists from South America, from South Asia, So it was a fairly international cohort, although they were all based in the UK. And it built up quite a distressing picture, really, of how difficult it is to thrive on any level in the art world if you are somebody with caregiving responsibilities. And in that, under that bracket, I'd also put anyone who's caring for a family member or for elderly parents as well. And so the results of that study appeared in an essay called Full, Messy and Beautiful, which is in the 2019 Freelands Foundation report. Having built up this rather upsetting picture of what things were like for artist parents, I then worked with a group of 30 artist parents to put together a manifesto called How Not to Exclude Artist Parents, and that's up online. It's available in 16 languages and audio described, and it's without copyright. It's absolutely free to be used by anyone in any way they want. And that was really provided as a tool for artists to be able to use as kind of evidence of the way that they would hope that an organization they were working with might treat them, but also as a group of suggestions specifically for institutions, for museums and for residencies. While I was engaged in all of this research, I kept fielding messages from people working in other sectors of the art world, quite often academics or curators, or people working in various different freelance capacities, educators, and so on, really telling me about how difficult things were in their sector, how really very tricky it was to advance, to have any kind of career advancement as a parent, particularly if you were working part-time or you'd had to take significant career breaks to bring up a family. And I'd been doing all of this work with artists, but it occurred to me at a certain point that I really needed to start looking into the situation for art workers as well, because clearly the art world has a problem dealing with people with, you know, these terrible bourgeois considerations like families. I mean, you know, who'd do that if you're in the art world? You know, we're all meant to be bohemians out, you know, drinking absinthe and partying until 3 o'clock in the morning, not looking after children or family members. So when I launched my book, just after when I launched my book, How Not to Exclude Artist Mothers and Other Parents, I held a little kind of mini festival, mini symposium, and we had a few conversations and discussions around various subjects in the art world. And at the same time, together with Joe Harrison, who runs a project called Repronomics, which looks at the intersection of economics and reproduction and with a kind of art world edge, we launched a new organization called the Art Working Parents Alliance, which is free to join. It's for workers in the art world, so that can be academics, educators, technicians, curators, people in the auction houses, people in comms, writers, people in the media, broadcasters. So there's a really broad range of different roles in the art world represented. And the idea was, on the one level, just simply to get people talking to one another and sharing their experiences. As Michelle says, so much of this is to do with solidarity, to do with networking, to do with putting people together and realizing that actually you're not going through this alone, that other people are having similar experiences, and to start to build up a pattern of behaviors and kind of common things that are bedeviling different people in different career sectors. And so we do that partly through setting up WhatsApp groups so that people can, you know, share their experiences. And also partly we're working towards a symposium, which we're hoping to hold later this year. We're thinking probably September, but it's not set in stone yet, where we're going to work towards building up toolkits so that people can negotiate with their employers around things like maternity leave, and to draw up kind of codes for best practice around various things in the various different sectors, so that there could be specific ones for academics, specific ones for people working in the public sector, and so on. I'd quite like to share some of the feedback I've had from members of the AWP when I asked them about pay equity in museums and for suggestions of what to talk about. So I'm going to briefly share my screen, and I'm going to share just a few quotes from various different people that have come back to me. I have a few more that I will come back to with a subsequent question with Michelle, because she wanted to talk particularly about pay in British museums, which is pretty catastrophic. So although I'm not looking specifically at pay in these particular quotes, the kind of umbrella that's going over all of these is that the pay in the museum sector in the UK is very, very low. I should also say that art working parents is very much parents, it's not just mothers. So although you're hearing all of these quotes through my voice, that not all of the voices that I'm representing are of women, they're of all parents. So this first quote, I really wanted also to start off by looking at people working in the education sector, because I think I get the feeling that quite a few of the people that are on this, I don't know why this is probably my prejudice, but I feel that there are going to be quite a few art historians and people working in the curatorial sector. So I wanted to look a little bit at the education sector, because I know that there are some quite specific issues that are difficult for parents in that sector. So our first member said, if you work in the learning sector, there's a limited range of options, particularly for single parents, because weekend, evening and holiday work is required by many of the programs. I've ended up primarily working in schools and teachers programs, which has limited my options when it comes to career movement. So I think this is there are particular considerations for single parents that are perhaps make work in the education sector really tricky. And this was echoed by another correspondent who also pointed out that most learning and education roles are on temporary and 0 hours contracts at living wage or below. Yet often they still ask for an MA or at least BA and experience. Work in these roles is often during weekends and school holidays, so for a single parent with younger children would be impossible. The pay is never enough to live on, but are needed often to gain experience or to get a foot in the door. Even if you do manage to get onto the next rung, the pay remains low. Another of our correspondents pointed out just how competitive it is getting any kind of role in the museum sector in whatever area of the museum. So they said there's an issue with overqualification. 10 years ago, I applied for a part-time job in a museum shop, a supervisor, not a manager role, a grade 2 job with a minimum qualification of maths GCSE. So in the UK, GCSE is a qualification you get around the age of 16. So I guess it's like is it end of middle school, beginning of high school? It's not the final grade. Apparently they only interviewed a number of individuals with a job going to an MA graduate in museum studies, a job in the shop being a foot in the door. One thing that really came through is that because of the low pay, it became really difficult for anyone without some other kind of support really to be able to thrive in the sector. So this correspondent said, if I didn't have a partner, I wouldn't be able to support myself in London. That's one of the reasons I keep close ties with my home country in continental Europe and work my 5th day as a curator. And the other 4 days I work compressed hours to knock out a day off, which will be difficult with another baby on the way. So there's very much this feeling that I think a lot of people have of trying to keep an iron in the fire, so that they've got almost an escape route from the British museum sector, which is really quite sad. And there's also a cultural issue around what's expected of people just as a kind of given in the sector. My experiences on entering motherhood in 2010 in London was that there was a definite culture against art working parents. I worked at a major London gallery. Staff referred to parents as part-timers, as they would leave work on time rather than staying late. So I think there's a view, this is not necessarily to do with pay equity, but I think there are clearly lots of issues towards the expectations that come with working in the museum sector that, together with the salaried role, there are all of these extras that are expected of people, whether that's lots of overtime, with the expectation that we're going to be working at weekends and during holidays, which become quite difficult when you're trying to reconcile that with a family life as well. At that point, I'm going to hand back to you, Michelle. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Hettie. And I'm going to invite you to stay on and also invite Nicole to stay on. And as you're getting your cameras back on, thank you both very, very much for helping not only set the scene, but really expand the possibilities of the conversation that we can have. And because I missed out due to my Wi-Fi troubles, I'm going to describe myself. I am a white woman with blonde hair that could have used a brush probably before coming onto this Zoom. But I had meetings before at my understaffed museum department, and so didn't get to do that. I'm wearing a black polo neck. I have my lanyard from the museum around my neck. My shoulders and sleeves are bare, and I'm sitting in a library, so I have lots of archival boxes behind me. I'm also really conscious that we have probably amazing colleagues in the Zoom room with us. So if you have questions, or if you even want to, it's not a question, but you want to share some of your experience in the chat, I'm going to be looking out for it just now, and I really warmly welcome you to participate in the discussion. I know that we have folks Zooming in, I think, from the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh who are in the midst of unionization, as you said, Nicole, calling them out. And so thank you for being here with us today. I wanted to ask both of you, first of all, this is not a new conversation, obviously, around pay equity. I think what you were saying absolutely tracks, Hettie, in terms of pay equity, in terms of the idea that, you know, if a job, you're meant to be paid for 40 hours a week, but then the person next to you is expected to do 60, 70, 80, 90 hours to fulfill the quota or the expectations of that job, then you are always at a disadvantage if you cannot do that for any other circumstance or restriction on your time or responsibility or just choice that you might have outside of the workplace. And I think, Nicole, that came in terms of what you were saying around not having family access into social networks or other things that kind of power and make the art world go around. And so these ideas are certainly not new necessarily. They've been in the public consciousness for a really long time. But I wanted to ask you both if you have a sense of what is particular to this moment in time, this particular historical moment in time, from your conversations, perhaps Hettie, from the experiences that you've had organizing over the past couple of years, Nicole. Like, what are we facing right now in terms of the, not just the issue of pay equity, but the kind of historical structures that people are grappling with as they try to either act in solidarity around it, or they are responding to it. I think of, for example, in the UK, austerity and budget cutting. I think of the pandemic and furloughs, for example, and people having sort of a can-do mentality because we've had to sort of jury-rig so many things over the last couple of years because we've been working in less than ideal circumstances. So what are the ways in which you see this particular historical moment contributing to how we shape this conversation on pay equity? And maybe I'll start with you, Nicole, if I may.
Sure. Yeah. No, I mean, it's a great set of questions, and I think that when I think about what's happening right now, I think that I'm going to. I had just read a recent article that came out on why there's been such a boom in union organizing by Mindy Isser. And she quotes my colleague, Sarah Shaw, who I met at the PMA and is now a organizer with AFSCME, our affiliate. And Mindy in the interview asked Sarah, you know, kind of what she was seeing in the past couple of years. And Sarah mentioned that one thing she's seeing is that more and more people who are entering into new jobs at our museum and at other museums are coming in with a pre-existing knowledge of unionizing and organizing, even if they don't have practical experience themselves. I think that students are especially attuned to these conversations happening. My partner is an educator at Rutgers, and their 3 unions are on strike right now. Yeah. Just starting this week. So I think that there's such, I think that listening to emerging professionals, students or not, is hugely important. And because they're the people who are navigating these issues in the real world, these are people who, you know, like myself right now, are looking like on the market, looking for work, and trying to cobble things together. And so I think that the scarcity is certainly feeling very intense, but I think on the flip side, then the knowledge and the interest and the openness towards unions and workers, just workers collectively advocating for themselves, I'm constantly impressed by more emerging or younger activists than myself, and learning from them all the time. And I think that focus by people starting out is pretty unique to now. I don't feel that there just hadn't been as many collective conversations around workers' rights, labor rights. So I think it's sort of, on the one hand, there's this push, there's this energy, but it's also coming up against a lot of both lingering issues with labor rights in this country coming out of the Trump administration, and then also the scarcity and shedding staff mindset that's come out of the pandemic as well.
Thank you, Nicole. And I love that idea that folks are coming into museums with a different set of expectations, which is great. I think about starting off as a curator, as a curatorial assistant at MoMA, and there was an existing union there. It was one of the very few museums that had an existing union that started in the 1970s. And I wish in many ways I thought more about that history when I was there. I sort of took it as read that it was just something that we had, that I didn't have to ask for a pay raise every year. It came because the union existed. And so I think in concert with this sort of consciousness raising, keeping these ideas out in the open, making sure that the conversation is always still live and happening, so that people do enter in with these expectations which are correct. Also making sure that we continue to think about histories of these movements so that we understand what had to happen to get us to this place, and making sure that we never lose sight of that, both as organizing tools for people who need them in places that haven't been organized, but also to understand that it hasn't always been this way, and vigilance around these types of rights and needs and wants is how we keep them in the first place. And I'm going to ask you a little bit about your archiving activity with the union in that as well in a second. But Hettie, I wonder if you would be able to answer the same question, because you live in the UK, so it might be slightly different there, but I think there are certainly complemences as much as divergences. What are some of the specific historical what's the specific historical milieu there for you in terms of pay equity?
I mean, I think on a positive level, one of the drivers to discussions around this has been the recognition that there's a chronic lack of diversity, particularly in the visual arts in the UK. And when we start to talk about how you start to bring social mobility and greater diversity into the visual arts, one of the big impediments is obviously that, you know, the fact that currently pay in the museum and public sector is very much pitched, so you pretty much have to have generational wealth to be able to survive in that sector. So I'm hoping that's part of what's kind of fueling this. In terms of discussion around family stuff, I mean, oddly enough, I think the pandemic had a really interesting role in that it suddenly made people's personal lives very visible, because we were all zooming in from home. And so there was this recognition that actually everybody had this other stuff going on that they needed to attend to. So I think in the wider world of work, that's actually become much more of an acceptable topic to start talking about caregiving responsibilities and the fact that actually you do need to spend time doing something for your child, or you know, doing a kind of school meeting or something like that. So in a funny kind of way, it's made that more permissible as a topic, and this whole kind of a matter around family life or being a mother, God forbid, in the art world has lifted somewhat. And then of course in the UK we've had austerity for 13 years.
Time. Yeah.
But I think one thing that it's something that was actually touched on by Nicole, interestingly, when she did her introduction, is that there's been this really toxic discourse around the arts and what's seen as the fine arts. Thanks to the rise of kind of much more populist rhetoric, that any kind of concern around something like whether it's classical music or visual art has been kind of poo-pooed as being the purview of the liberal elite, and it's not of general interest, that it's, you know, just a few stuck up people. And so I think that's allowed almost, I think, you know, kind of funding within the arts to kind of reach a total crisis point, really, because they've been seen as less and less of a priority, because they're allowed to dismiss them with the idea that, well, it's just for a privileged few, as opposed to the idea that this is something that's really important culturally. I mean culturally in the broadest possible sense.
Yeah. I want to come back to that. It seemed an incredibly important point that you have both raised. Before I do that, I want to read the chat for a second, actually, because it's really nice that people are getting involved. Jessica, thank you. It's so great to know that many of your young employees are really pumped to be in a unionized workplace. That's awesome. And advocates, yes, thank you. And I feel like we are all advocating for ourselves by being in this space together, having the conversation. I wanted to ask you both. We were sort of given the mandate by Sylvia and Hannah and Janina to think about concrete tools for pay equity. And we've talked about the salary transparency spreadsheet, the unionization of museum workplaces or arts workplaces, but those things only go so far. I think about freelancing and independent work, for example, and the protections that are not offered by a workplace. And so coming together, as you were talking about, Hettie, in one's own group, thinking about an alliance of people and using something as simple but direct as a WhatsApp group. Are there specific and concrete tools that you both can think of over and above the sort of notion of unionization or salary transparency spreadsheets? Are there resources that you would direct people to that you haven't noted already this evening? Or is it really in many ways the act of solidarity of continuing to have this conversation out in public that allows for these networks and alliances, whether they are between 2 people, 10 people, or 200 people or more, to be formed and to keep us moving forward? And so, Nicole, maybe I'll ask you first.
Sure. Yeah, I don't have my links ready for the chat, but I think we'll be following up about that as well. Yeah, it's an interesting, so many unions, the approach of many unions in the US are workplace dependent. They're based on a specific workplace or group of workplaces rather than looking at a job category, and the way that there are some, and then there are other unions that also operate that more like that, I guess, with SAG-AFTRA or something like that. So as I would love to see us move in the direction of having larger national conversations here about arts workers, arts and culture workers. And I think that a lot of great professional organizations have been participating in those. I think that Association of Art Museum Curators has had some important, has left open some really important formats for these kinds of conversations, I think. And certainly, I think that I also wanted to give a shout out to the Small Museums Association, where I spoke earlier this year. I think I saw a question about the relevance of unionizing or organizing in smaller organizations. And I'm just here to say that you only need you and one other person who has a similar job in your workplace in order to be able to form a union legally, according to the guidelines of the National Labor Board here in the US. And I think that that question was around financial specifically, which I could also talk about, but just to the point of resources, I think that that show that the fact that they're supporting conversations says that that organizing, that coming together collectively is relevant in smaller institutions, and that you actually have a lot more power as a small staff. The museum was able, the PMA was able to hire scabs out of New York to install our Big Fall blockbuster exhibition at a smaller organization. I think that there might be even more power in collective power. And I'll follow up with other, I should also mention AFSCME through our affiliate International Union has a great initiative called Culture Workers United also. That is dependent to AFSCME, but also takes a really broad look at what's happening in culture organizing right now in this country.
We will make sure all of these links and references, if you're scribbling them down furiously, also make it to your inbox as part of the follow-up after this. Hettie, anything else that you wanted to add in terms of resources there?
In terms of, well, so I was going to mention, so I mean, you were talking about pay transparency. We've had a really brilliant initiative for artists specifically, but artists working with public commissions, public organisations in the UK, led by a group called Industria. They've recently released the report Structurally Fucked, which is looking at, so you can access online the full report, and that's actually very much looking at what I was talking about for freelancers, which is this issue of being paid a project fee. And so they were looking at really some of the largest, most kind of prestigious institutions in London. So it would be like the equivalent of doing something for MoMA or the Met, and they worked out that people were essentially on over the course of a large project earning about $3 an hour. And this is, you know, what you'd imagine to be an artist at the top of the tree. So I think that kind of pay transparency, that it's great when you have a really well coordinated report like that, and it's generated quite a lot of press. There are also, I think we've been quite, I mean, obviously, as I said, we're very much a baby organization, so we started in October of last year, so I can't speak from our personal experience about what's been effective so far, but organizations that we've been really inspired by, they include Pauline D'Souza's Diversity Forum, which we can provide the link for. And I think one of the powerful things about Diversity Forum is they technically work as kind of observers, so they're there watching to make sure that people are behaving right. And I think this idea that you're being watched and reported on by a benign organization that's just trying to make sure that best practice is being observed, I think is quite powerful. We've also been really interested in the Gallery Climate Coalition, which has been inviting organizations to sign up to best practice, the codes of best practice. So I think this idea of having an established code of best practice, of putting together tools that organizations can implement quite easily to perhaps improve the way that they're behaving towards their, well, in our case, towards working parents, but it could be all kinds of different considerations.
Thank you both so much. Those resources are absolutely fantastic. I know that we are a minute away from the end of the session, but I'm going to beg if we might have just 5 more minutes, because we have excellent questions in the chat, and I knew that they would come as people sort of got warmed up to the conversation. We understand if you cannot stay on, that's absolutely fine. People may have a next meeting to go to at 5 p.m. But Hettie and Nicole, would you give us the pleasure of 5 more minutes of your company, because there's some really good ones. Great. So some of them are easier to answer quickly. Some of them will take a little bit longer. There is somebody saying, do you think it's time for a new pay transparency spreadsheet or project? And I think there's always time for that. Certainly the National Emerging Museum Professionals is thinking about some of these questions live right now. And I would encourage you to go to their site. They're a brilliant resource. And as you said, Nicole, they really are thinking about folks emerging into the field. And they have a huge amount of both energy and expertise. And they have been thinking about pay transparency, unpaid internships, and they have several live spreadsheets and projects going. So you can find resources. We'll send you again the link, but it was in the chat earlier. And that also connects to, so go ahead, Hettie.
I think that's something that's really needed in the UK as well. I didn't get time to go through the pay stuff in the UK, but one thing that was really coming out was that as soon as people had 1 child, let alone 2 child, that essentially their job in the museum sector became a hobby because it didn't their travel and their childcare.
Yeah, I remember reading in The Guardian probably just under a year ago, on the same day that I saw a job posted, that the average cost for childcare in London was $19,000. And there was a job posted in a significant, well-known gallery, museum, I should say, in London for $19,000, £90,000, sorry, I should say. And I emailed the person who I know is the director of the museum and said, are you kidding? Who do you think can apply and be part of this workforce? And it certainly wasn't a junior position either. It was somebody who very may well have had family responsibilities, caring responsibilities, etc. This connects to another question that is in the Q&A. Can we comment on the role of AAM for US-based arts workers and their recent policy that requires, and they said in quotes, a salary figure or range on all postings to their job board? As we all know, this went into effect at the end of last year in November. However, enforcement has been really lax. At various times since then, there's been upwards of 5 posting with no ranges or figures. At this moment, there are at least 3, those having been posted by the Baltimore Museum of Art and the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Hettie and Nicole, I welcome any thoughts you have. Again, I would direct people in one mode of recourse to the National Emerging Museum Professionals website, where you can actually send a link for a job that has been posted without salary, and that can be tackled and followed up on by them. But I'm wondering, Hettie and Nicole, if you think there are other ways in which we can hold places like AAM or the Knife Jobs Board or other jobs posting sites accountable to the laws that are now here, in some states at least, to insist upon salary transparency as part of wage equity. And maybe Nicole, I can direct that to you since we're here in the US.
Sure. Yeah. I think that, yeah, there should always be new pay transparency initiatives for as long as it remains this strange, secretive, closed door process, both in the arts and outside of the arts. So yeah, there's always more room for that work. I mean, I think to speak for AMT, we've continued our activism in other ways. It was a pretty big unpaid lift of labor that went into maintaining it also. And then also just to speak to this continuing resistance against transparency. I mean, I think these workplaces know what they're hiding, and what they're hiding is that the pay is not good. And so I think I'll advocate for one thing, which might seem strange, but I have started doing it. So I work with interns and fellows, and so that leaves me in a position where often if there's not relevant information about a entry-level position posted, I'll reach out to someone at the organization to directly say, I'm in a position to be forwarding information to current interns and fellows, emerging professionals, but I make a practice of not forwarding things if there's not the relevant information attached. Would you consider that? And I don't always hear back from someone, but sometimes I do. And I think it's important for people at these places to hear that this is, even if they have what appear to be robust applicant pools, that these are turning people away from applying. So I think this is another area where like the scarcity in the field masks how bad things are sometimes, because you'll just keep getting so many applicants because the job market's so constrained, even for these kind of horrible positions, or positions with no relevant information attached. Yeah, we'll leave it there.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just quite like to add to that, because I think it really, I mean, this connects very much with what Nicole's saying. One of the things that really came up at one of the points one of the correspondents from Art Working Parents made was that essentially because so many jobs have been cut in the UK, that many people in the curatorial staff are ending up having to do essentially the work of about 3 people. So even if the pay looks okay, I think when we talk about pay equity, it's not just to do with the pay attached to a role, it's what that pay covers. And if you're essentially doing the work of 3 people, it's not necessarily good pay for the work that you're doing. So there are other ills being hidden behind this as well.
Absolutely. And I can say that's the substance of my grievance. Actually, at the museum, we used to have a department of 8 people. We now have a department of 2 people. And so my grievance is saying, I'm really, happy to help in a pinch, but I would like to be recognized for that work if we are doing that, given that multiple of the roles in our department have had vacancies for upwards of 9 months. It's not that somebody couldn't have been hired in this position. It is either a cost-saving measure or a deliberate strategy on behalf of the museum that impacts the workers in that department. And I will say, because of the union, we've been able to file grievances and win sometimes tens of thousands of dollars in back pay for people who have had that experience. The difficulty is making sure that that can happen for everybody. There are entrenched ideas about who can have that kind of pay, and sometimes it is based on traditions that have happened in different departments at the museum. So one manager sees it as important, another manager is horrified by it. Why wouldn't you just be grateful to be at work? And then part of it is about the seniority of the person and whether or not you're expected to fill in or not expected to fill in for other types of jobs. So we have a question in the chat from Elizabeth, and we also have one more question in the Q&A, and I'm going to try and sandwich them together because I want people to be able to benefit from the amazing speakers that we have and also this sharing of knowledge that's coming out from these wonderful questions. Nicole, can you give a very rapid fire answer to why was AMT stopped? Elizabeth is asking in the chat, and we also had another anonymous question to that effect. So why did we stop at the end of 2019? We started end of May 2019, it wrapped in the end of the year, and it was for very specific reasons.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really didn't realize the scope of the project when we first started sharing that free editable Google sheet around, and it quickly grew into a multi-person team where we were managing social media. We were all doing a lot of research. We were maintaining the spreadsheet itself. And we also thought at the same time that it was really important to preserve it as a snapshot in time, to have that good kind of year's worth of, or nearly year's worth of data, but to recognize it as a finite thing, because we also felt that the data would start becoming confusing if it is maintained in the same spreadsheet over time. And even by the time we were wrapping it up, there were newer initiatives, which we've talked about a little bit here. I do also just want to mention again, it was a lot of unpaid labor, and it's unfortunate that in these conversations, it's often down to volunteer activists who can take this work on. And but I think everyone who was involved in any way has continued on their activism in other ways.
Absolutely. And I think part of the reason in a sense for closing it too was that it went viral. It was this public conversation, and that part was really important. But there is an interesting tension between how much can be done in a conversation that can be shared so quickly on things like social media and what actually takes work to change, which is often the rolling up of one's sleeves and going days and days and weeks and weeks and months and years to create the alliances, be they unions or independent watchdogs or independent groups or collectives. And that is sometimes at tension actually with the attention span that we have on social media around these particular issues. And so I think for us, in many ways, moving our labor from what it took to create the sort of public facing element of that, and to very intentionally move away from social media applications of it and really go, and all of us ended up in some way being involved in, I think, union organizations or other forms of labor organizing, that was particularly important. I have one last question for you, Hettie, and then a way to wrap it up with somebody else's great question. So one of the Q&A questions talks about Millar Fisher's work, which I love, addressing art, labor, museum labor, and motherhood, but they make a really fair critique of it, saying that personally, I find her work well-intentioned, but ultimately performative and ineffectual. And I think there's a larger question tied to that in terms of how we can talk about the political issues, the social issues, the cultural and economic issues that we often do within the galleries of a museum space or a public institution, and the ways in which those artworks and even those artists actually are sometimes very separated from the art workers who put their work on display or are dealing with the human resources systems that keep the organizations running, that show the work and bring it to publics. And so I'm wondering how that tension surfaced in your research, because you were talking to artists who were also parents. And I wonder how that question gets addressed in your mind of artwork that deals with this subject, but also thinking about the art workers who are collaborating on bringing this artwork into the public view.
I mean, I think that this idea that the artists aren't also some of the art workers who are working as museum invigilators or working in the cafes and working in the shops is, that seems really artificial to me. I think most artists are needing to do quite often quite badly paid work to support themselves and their practice. So I think that somewhat kind of dives into this idea that, yeah, I mean, I think there's not necessarily a massive division. And I would say certainly with Millar Fisher's work, you know, thinking about the Maintenance Art Manifesto, she's really talking about what kinds of knowledge and what kind of expertise that we value in the art world, and the idea that there's a whole set of values that we don't put much, so there are a whole set of skills that we don't value very much in the world, which in a way comes to the nub of this whole question about pay equity and, you know, and who's expected to labor for free because they're doing something special, and who's seen as being quite kind of disposable within that infrastructure. And she was talking about bringing her day-to-day work as a parent into the art gallery and performing all of those tasks like ironing or mopping the floor or making dinner. So I think, I mean, certainly when there have been studies done into the income of artists in the UK, they come out as extremely low income people. And like, I mean, it's like around, I think it's something like around £11,000 a year. I mean, very, very low indeed. So I think the idea that they're living some kind of wonderful life, eating lobster and drinking champagne and just kind of paying lip service to people in low income jobs is probably a slightly artificial view of things. I mean, it's obviously very easy for me to say. I'm sitting here in, you know, my nice large bedroom as a kind of middle class woman, but I don't think there's this kind of absolute separation that we might see.
Imagine.
But one of the things that's really important to make sure that there isn't that complete separation is to keep driving for this pay equity, to make sure that it's not only people that have some kind of support, some kind of independent wealth, who can work in the visual arts sector as well. So we do need to keep driving for it because it's becoming less equal rather than more equal.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the sort of performativity of these ideas is often the institution who's welcoming in this subject matter, whether it's about motherhood, whether it's about diversity or difference of ideas in other forms through artwork. And it's not necessarily the artists themselves who are the performative element. It is the museum who is unable to keep house behind the scenes and think about an effectual HR policy that actually thinks about and bends towards the needs of its workers. I want to close here, I think, because you had an extra 15 minutes rather than extra 5. I'm deeply grateful to you both, Hettie and Nicole, and also to the wonderful comments. I want to shout out Elsa Hiltner, who is talking about on our team a checklist and certification program for orgs to use to grow pay equity. So another resource that we will send out with the email at the end. And then others talking about the Hall of Shame, deplorable job descriptions, new research coming out from Ithaca S&R. So many great resources here that we will make sure that gets to you when we send a thank you email at the end. I want to close with one question that came up in the Q&A. And what's the source of funding that supports unionized pay raises? Is it endowment? Being able to pay people equity? This question asker, Helen, is saying that admissions don't bring in enough. They're imagining, and smaller museums don't have the necessary endowment dollars to support funding for pay raises or pay equity. They ask, is unionizing in a small museum not an option because of this? And I would be interested, Hettie and Nicole, in any last words you have around this. I think for me, thinking about that question, if there is not an adequate source of funding to support equitable pay in an institution, that institution may not exist, or should perhaps not exist, or should not exist in the format, either the level of output that is being required from them by its board, by its governance structures, by its public, unless that can be found. And if it cannot, then a different structure, a different expectation, a different output should be in place. And so I think it's less about panicking and thinking, well, we have to do this much, and so we have to find this many funds. What do we have funds for? And we need to do that much with it until we can grow at a sustainable rate to do the other things that we think we need to do. And that comes down to a lot of different things, not just being able to fundraise, not just having a board and governance that are on board with that, but having somebody with a strategic vision that can actually get people to buy into it. Hettie and Nicole, on that last question, any notes on it or any notes in general that you would like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been this model of museums where there's this feeling that they need to grow and grow and grow, and they need to build more wings, and they need to be doing more stuff, and they need to be acquiring more works. And perhaps we need to instead be thinking about shrinking, which I know is not necessarily popular given how many people are being educated to come into the museum sector at the moment and how much demand there is for jobs. But I think if a museum can't pay the artists it's working with a living wage or like a decent wage, if it can't pay its workers properly, then there's something very deeply structurally wrong with the whole thing. And of course, in the UK as well, we have quite a different funding structure for a lot of museums. So there's some public funding, but there's also quite a lot of sponsorship, and then the sponsorship's often very controversial, whether if that comes from, particularly if it comes from extractive industries. So I think rethinking I think, as you say, Michelle, it really needs to be a complete structural rethink. It can't just be kind of shoving a band-aid onto things and kind of putting things up temporarily.
Absolutely. And Nicole, any last words on your part?
Yeah, I will 100% agree with that. I would say, like, very practically, where does the money for union raises come from? It comes from the general operating budget. And so it requires rethinking that pie chart and those graphs to see where the money is going. And I think that that also intersects with other real issues facing the arts worlds and museums around sustainability and thinking about the environment. The taxing nature of the quick pace special exhibition culture as a whole is extractive of people and resources in all sorts of different ways. So I think that, yeah, we need boards we need senior management and leadership and boards to hear this and to keep hearing it, that we need to rethink this field if the arts and museum fields are going to be sustainable pathways in the future.
Yeah. And Jessica, you make a very good point. This isn't everybody's issue. Some institutions are wildly well endowed. And so I think maybe I will close by responding to your excellent point in the chat and saying one of the best resources that we have for pay equity is solidarity amongst our colleagues. Having these conversations, knowing the histories of these conversations and continuing to have them, not just when we think it is necessary for us or even our particular institution, but every single day in every single way, making sure that it's something that is just part and parcel of coming into the workplace, that it is an act of solidarity always to talk about and to argue for pay equity for ourselves and for everybody else, regardless of how often we interact with them or how well we know their job description or even how well we know their institution. It seems like a very trite thing in some ways to say that, but I do think that when we act together, it is much harder for people to fight against the recognition that pay equity is at the heart of every other kind of equity in our workplaces, whether they are art museums or something else. Thank you so much, Hettie. Thank you so much, Nicole, for being here. Thank you, Sylvia and Janina and Hannah, for having us. And Sylvia, I will hand back to you to lead us out. Thank you.
Thank you so much to all of you for a tremendously inspiring talk today. I hope that everybody who is listening and will watch this video later will take the resources and the words that you've offered to make change in their workplace and in their lives and feel supported in the solidarity that I think you have mentioned, Michelle, and I think is integral to the process moving forward. I want, as you've heard mentioned several times, we will email everyone with links and further resources and a link to the video as well. So for now, I would like to just say thank you. Thank you all.